welcome to my panel, and welcome to the audience. We've got a large crowd. Thank you very much. So, thinking we've got a pretty large panel, and I thought I'd group it conceptually. So we've got the ministers or stewards, if you like, and politicians, the folks who invest capital, and two of them have a technocratic background, Patrick and Leslie, and then of course Mr. G, and then lastly, Cassandra, you come from an entrepreneurial journey, don't you? Having invested in greenfields renewables projects. And then lastly, Sabine, one of, we should have had two, but one of, and thank you for being here, a representative of an overseas OEM, but of course located in South Africa now. Thank you. So infrastructure is a complex topic. If I could describe it in my simple mind, it's long dated, it's risky, it requires institutional capability. There are complementary investments that need to make it real. You got to go through bureaucratic processes. You need sufficient pools of capital to make it real. And perhaps, so it carries with it a high level of risk. And it carries with it, I think, the ambitions of a nation. We can see in our infrastructure our future. And I think that's an important starting point, because in a world where there are competing interests, I guess we need a vision, or competing needs that need to be serviced by the fiscus. We need to have a model for how we allocate capital between these complex requirements, and indeed competing visions for the future of our country. Minister Mboweni, if I may start with you. My question relates to three themes, if you like. Sequencing, one. Two, screening, if you like. And then third, signaling or shouting. Signaling or shouting, how do we shout about the fact that we want a future with infrastructure that serves the people of this country? Sequencing, we can't have it all at once. How do you allocate capital between these competing interests? If you may, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Well, if we don't have infrastructure, you will most probably not have water at home. You will not have electricity. You will not be able to drive to work. You will not be able to fly to Cape Town from the airport, and so on and so forth. You will not, you will not be able to have access to your internet because you have not invested in the correct things to make you get access to the internet. So that combination of things says, yes, you have to have a very clear policy position, where you're going, when. But there are some basic infrastructure issues which more often than not cannot wait, have to be done immediately. As it is, we are faced with enormous pressures on the part of the fiscus, and therefore we have to enter into private-public partnerships in order to address the huge infrastructure demands that we have. I'll give an example. To refurbish the old groundwater bulk water system is an urgent matter, because if we don't attend to it, the consequences for Gauteng and the other regions is very serious. We have to continue with the Gauteng freeway improvement project, because without that, we are all in a permanent traffic jam, and we are unable, therefore, to arrive at home, at work, or at home to do what we need to do. We have to think very seriously about other modes of transportation which require large infrastructure expenditure, such as the extension of the Gautrain to the West Rand and probably to Soweto. So all of these things, as I say, are costly, but these are investments for the future. And therefore, the idea of bringing together a blended infrastructure fund becomes very important for us, because we can't fund it all together from the fiscus. And this infrastructure fund is something that probably Mr. Baloyi will speak about, because we're situating this blended infrastructure fund at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Yes, you have to identify what the nature of the problem. You have to identify what projects to get involved in, and you have to budget and fund and find a way of funding them in the most fiscally sustainable way.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Gordhan, if I can direct my next question to you. In this world with competing interests and complexity, we need to look seriously at our SOEs, and you're responsible for some of the largest ones in our economy, so-called Schedule 2s. They define, in many ways, the future of our country. How do you see the kind of institutional innovations that we're going to need to make? How do we insulate them from some of the noisiness of the past decade? How do we make sure that they're a credible partner for some of the infrastructural investment that we anticipate having to make? They're ultimately, I guess, our agents as South Africans in driving us into the future.
Thank you. Is it working? If you take the two biggest SOEs that we have, Eskom and Transnet, they both are quite crucial both to the economy and to society, firstly. Secondly, we need a clear plan in addition to what my colleague has said, for example, on the energy front. So we now have an integrated resource plan. And in the case of Transnet, we need to understand what kind of economy we have, and largely at the moment we are exporters of commodities, mineral commodities, but there's huge potential for Transnet in two respects at the moment. Firstly, increasing their market share on the commercial freight side, but also putting out more branch lines, and that's where investment comes in, into agricultural and other areas, particularly in the farming and rural parts of South Africa, so that it improves the logistics, the travel, and the ease of access to markets as well. The other key area that Transnet deals with are our ports. At the moment, our ports are not performing as well as they should, but we're in the process of beginning to revitalize them, but they also require a fair amount of investment as well. So there's the economy and society, there's the National Development Plan, there's the role that these two entities play, which are both vital to the economy and its competitiveness, but also its stability and sustainability as well. The next question is whether those institutions, which are fairly old, between 70 and 80 years old, in terms of where their origins lie, are today fit for purpose, either in terms of the markets in which they operate. So the energy market is changing quite formidably, and the technologies in the energy market is very rapidly changing, both in terms of energy generation, but also energy transmission as well. We'll leave the distribution side for now. And the question we've got to ask in our current context is, how do we get operational efficiency? How do we cut costs? And how do we create a sustainable operational and financial environment on the one hand? And on the other hand, begin the process, as the President pointed out earlier on, of reshaping this entity so that it's fit for purpose into the future. And that's where creating the separate entities on generation, transmission, and distribution comes in. And of course, the question of the role of the state, which is quite crucial on the transmission side, which the worldwide is recognized as a strategic asset, is on the one hand quite important. On the other hand, we've got to recognize the reality that generation is not going to be dominated by the state 20, 30 years from now. There's going to be a more diverse forms of generation in which the private sector will play a part, which it already does, for its own use in some of the mining sectors, but also through the renewable sector as well. On the Transnet side, I think there are similar issues that we need to look at, so that we make sure that the kind of investments that were announced by the acting CEO this morning are fitting in with the plans that we have for different parts of the country and the kind of economic and social development that we want to see. So government, as you know, is currently working on a district-level development planning and development model. And each of the SOEs will have to say and ask the question, what can we contribute in terms of infrastructure investment? But more generally, how do we make businesses more competitive? How do we contribute to lower administered prices? And how do we contribute to greater efficiencies for businesses on the one hand, but also at a societal level, make electricity far more affordable than it is. But we've got a whole lot of work to do over the next few years in order to create that level of sustainability, certainly on the energy side.
Thank you, Ministers. With your permission, I'll come back to you once we've warmed up a bit more. Patrick, you represent one of those institutional innovations Minister Mboweni was talking about. So you're going to be the custodian of 400 billion rands worth of taxpayer money, and you're hoping to crowd in up to an additional 600 million, perhaps topping up at about R1 trillion worth of capital to be deployed in infrastructure. Do you want to talk a bit about the innovations that describe the fund? In particular, I'm interested in the partnerships with our long-term savings industry.
Thank you very much, Derek. As both ministers actually have alluded, we will be looking after this infrastructure fund as a DBSA. But what is going to be key with this is that we are acting as a catalyst to leverage and to crowd in the private sector into the space and make sure that we're able actually to blend that with public finances. But we're looking for a system that is going to be less reliant on the backstop of the central fiscus, as we know the difficulty that our central fiscus is going through. So we will have to be extremely innovative in structuring these various projects. But these are projects actually that could easily be going beyond R1 trillion. We have identified almost 700 billion to come on top of this, but it's something that actually says we'll have to be quite coherent in identifying these projects. We'll have to be very clear in terms of what we make as priorities as a country, and we need to be very clear also in terms of because some of them are sitting at various stages in terms of their readiness and bankability or investability. So it's quite key that we then are able to very early deploy the project capital, which is the risk capital, to make sure that we then draw in the skill sets that will ensure that these things are well securitized, well structured, so that they become quite functional going forward. You know what is inherent in big projects. They tend to be very much delayed, very much over budget, most of the time out of spec. We need to start saying, how do we learn from the mistakes of the past and make sure that we are quite efficient in the deployment of the scarce capital so that there is a massified benefit to the country. They actually talk to various areas. I mean, here you're talking about in the water sector, in the transport sector, in the energy sector. You're also looking in the ICT sector. So they really span across many sectors of our economy. And we do believe that this is a program that if we approach it on a programmatic approach, as we did with the energy in terms of the IPP, we actually were behind the scenes in terms of supporting the IPP office in delivering the 200 billion that we're talking about on the energy sector. We do believe that employing the same system and model, it really can actually take us very far. But also the interesting thing is the engagement with the asset managers, the commercial banks and the pension funds was the level of willingness and readiness for them to come in and to also deploy their money into this. And they also, what was also quite positively pleasing was the fact that they are not expecting super returns because they understand some of this, they are public infrastructure, but they do want what is in the best interest of this country to make sure that there is an effective infrastructure and functional infrastructure that is also going to be aligned with proper maintenance And we need to build up some of the skill sets to make sure that South Africa has a very high infrastructure stock. But currently, the maintenance really falls very short. And this is something that we need to bring to an end. But we are quite excited at the possibilities that this infrastructure fund really presents, and also the potential impact, the stimulus impact that it holds to have, both in terms of being job rich, as well as a stimulus in terms of the GDP. So it's something that we're very excited about, but we are also quite clear that the challenges are going to be huge. But working together with the private sector, they tend to have all the capital that government doesn't have. They tend to have serious skill sets that does not sit in the public sector at this point in time. So really, if we're innovative and smart enough in working together in a coherent manner, it's going to be able to really go far in terms of shifting the needle for this country.
Patrick, I think it's an interesting development, right? The sums of money are large, but it's also a pragmatic response, I think, to understanding the risk profile of this country, right? If you invest your money in the stock exchange and you don't have an understanding of the risk of the underlying state of our infrastructure, well, then your models fall down, don't they? Absolutely. So while it may be a patriotic statement, it's also a pragmatic statement. Perhaps those are the best kind.
Absolutely, no, I fully agree, because this is something that really, for South Africans, for the first time, it will be able to bring together both the public and the private sector in a very meaningful way, potentially in a way that has never been seen before. But in our execution and implementation, we will have to be absolutely consistent and very coherent, so that it is able to bring about the promise that actually it holds.
I like the opportunity it gives to build mutual trust as well. I know this is weird, it's seeming linear, but perhaps it's because I had a hand in where people are sitting. Jasandra, I know you in two contexts, more latterly as an allocator of capital, and prior to that as an entrepreneur leading greenfields investments from cradle to grave in what was a nascent industry, and in fact, building your company into one of the leading investors with all the problems that are associated with infrastructural investment, but dare I say, of perhaps a lower base than some of our SOEs and so forth in terms of capital structure, skills, and so forth. Do you want to tell us a bit about that journey and some of perhaps the lessons that we can learn from that, and some of the things you'd like to see us remove from the playing field that represent obstacles in this important sector?
Great. Thank you, Derek. So I'm South African, and I came back to South Africa in 2011 to basically build a company called Biotherm Energy. It was a renewable energy platform, and timelessly with the IRP program that kicked off called REAP. We built out a really large business in terms of becoming one of the largest South African players in the renewable energy sector. We went through the REAP program, so worked quite closely with the IPP office. It was all auction-based, and in doing so, we attracted foreign investment. And I was not the only player in this market that did attract foreign investment. I was funded by a private equity group called Denham Capital, who I now work for. But in the last round, for example, there were projects or companies that were investing significant amounts of capital into these renewable energy projects. So there were high project costs, predominantly coming from foreign investors who were looking at this market from an equity perspective. In many instances, it was the commercial banks that partnered with these investors in order to build out the renewable energy industry here in South Africa. But in addition to that, there were also some CSP projects that were built, or in the process of being built, where the majority of the debt in itself is also coming from foreign investors, the AFDB, for example. And as a result of which, we've built up no longer a nascent industry in this country, but one where we've proven that the private sector, in partnership with government, has been able to build out new alternative energy sources that South Africa and South Africans have now come to rely on. In my experience, in the projects that we've built, all of those were brought online, on time, and within budget. We, during the construction period, had significant amounts of job creation. However, as is intrinsic with the renewable energy sector, during the operations period, you don't see that level of job creation as one would see from perhaps a hydrocarbon source, coal, for example. However, having said that, the program was not a bed of roses. It was challenged. And I think the biggest challenge that arose out of the program was the 4-year delay that the last round had experienced. So in that 4-year delay, prices went up, and thankfully, the PPAs that were secured in an auction, so competitively based, had to them linked an inflation index. So while the rand depreciated, to a large extent, the inflation indexation of the price, about, I would say 70% offset the currency volatility that many investors actually saw. And I believe that is one thing that we do need to keep as we go forward in terms of how we look at private sector collaboration for power generation assets. In addition to that, because of that delay, it killed the local supply chain. So one of the key aspects of the renewable energy program was to ensure that we will build a local supply chain. Those that came into play in rounds 2 and 3 in the South African program didn't have any other business during this 4-year of waiting. And as a result, to a large extent, the local supply chain was killed. There were no alternative opportunities for this local supply chain. So when you think about the infrastructure fund, and when we look at how we design things, we need to look at how we build local businesses that have the ability to generate revenue from more than one source. And I think that's very important because we need to create some form of redundancy in our system in order to create a local supply chain. And that is very important. In addition to that, I think it's important that when we send a message to international investors focused on the energy sector in South Africa, that we are going to stick to what we actually put forward in any particular round. So if we agree certain hurdles, if we agree certain parameters, stick to it, but more importantly, close as quickly as possible. And I'm going to give you an example from my life. When I came back to South Africa, I'd worked in clean energy in the US. I ran a clean energy fund. So I was buy side, and now came back to South Africa to actually build a business. And I happily thought that in our portfolio of round 1 assets, from site identification to actually bringing these projects online, it took us 3 years. And I thought that that could become the norm on the African continent, that we would continue doing this. And it didn't happen after that. So we did it in round 1, but on a go-forward basis, because of 4-year delays, because of all the challenges we've seen on the continent, it takes much longer than that. So keeping to our word, making sure it happens within a short period of time, building a solid local supply chain, thinking of it cleverly in terms of how we build in redundancy, and being competitive in terms of the financing we provide, how we look at local content, and how we actually create sustainable jobs, I think is actually very important. I just want to make one point when it comes to infrastructure and power projects. There's a difference between perceived risk and actual risk. So if you look at the latest March 2019 Moody's report on actual risk about power projects in Africa, the US, for example, has a 6% default rate. Africa is sitting at 0.9%. And we have to ask why we do that. It's because how we look at risk mitigation when we actually develop and go out to finance projects. And that is absolutely critical. And maybe I should say, from a humor perspective, if you could think of it from that, we're excluding some of the projects, large projects we've done in South Africa. But in general, that is basically the default rate here. So, Africa is not a risky place to do business. It's how we actually put together the projects, how we actually mitigate risk, and how we actually build it from a technical perspective as well.
Thank you. There was some... Thank you. There was some noise, obviously, so there were the delays, but there was also complexity around promises in contracts, or contracting, right? And the question I have, you consider those contracts sacrosanct? Yes? Yes. They underpin our relationship, being the state, with private investors, right? And you mess with that, and you could land yourself into trouble.
creates uncertainty more than anything else. And I think that is the challenge. So if we can take the noise out of the system in that regard and say South Africa is open for business and we are looking for investors to come along and work with the local South African economy to build out the power sector, let's go ahead and do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. G, you're both an allocator of capital, but you're also somebody who comes from a country whose growth has been underpinned and characterized by rapid investment in infrastructure. Complex projects rolled out, sophisticated projects rolled out on time, and I'm assuming you'll tell me otherwise, on budget. But what advice would you offer to South Africa in terms of facilitating accelerated infrastructure investment? One, and two, what are you seeing in the local environment that either gives you cause for saying, I'm ready to deploy capital, or there's some challenges I need resolved first?
Thank you, Chairman. The English is not my mother tongue. To the convenience of the audience, I try to speak my poor English. South Africa is our strategic partner. We pay much attention to the cooperation with South Africa. Before I talk, I would like to make a very brief introduction about the operation of the Caddy Fund. We operated this fund 12 years ago. At this moment, we already invested more than 90 projects across 36 African countries. Our investment, delivered investment, is over $3.5 billion. Our already committed, the investment is over $5 billion. We also leverage our projects, leverage more capital from China to Africa is over $24 billion. We also work with our parent company, China Development Bank. In the past decade, we already delivered more than $60 billion to African governments, companies, partners. Our money, including loans and equity investment, mainly go to agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, industrial park, and also natural resource development. Because we are friends, good friends and good brothers and sisters, and we are good partners. In South Africa, we already invested more than 10 projects. We cooperate with the Hyson, FAW, the Jidong cement manufacturer to set up the Mamba cement factory in South Africa. So we have quite a lot successful story in South Africa and in Africa. Regarding the investment in Africa, in fact, generally speaking, the economy of Africa is quite small at this moment. And for most of African government, they have a very weak financial fundamentals. And the international rating is quite low. So that's why 12 years ago, the Chinese government set up the Caddy Fund with the main purpose is to support the Chinese company to make investment in Africa, to help our African friends. So through the practice, I think to improve the investment environment is very important. For example, first, you should open your door to the international investor, just like we did 40 years ago. Mr. Deng Xiaoping launched the open door policy to the international capital. We support international investors make money in China, and we got development. This is why we developed so fast in the past 40 years. I think the Chinese story, successful story, is and will be an important reference for our African friends. You can learn something. In fact, 40 years ago, the Chinese people also were quite poor, but we're learning the knowledge, management, technology from advanced, developed country, for example, from Germany, from USA, from Japan. So also from UK, from France. So we did a good job. And also, we sincerely hope South Africa and also other African countries, you should provide investment convenience, such as visa, work permit, security, and also the local logistics. You should have maintain good policy, incentive policy, stability policy, and also consistent policy. That's very important, to create a favorable environment for the international investor. And you also have to improve your infrastructure. For example, energy, transportation, telecommunication. This is a very important platform for the economic development. 40 years ago, I think the Chinese government found the right policy to support the international capital to China. And they bring capital, technology, management, business model, new idea to China. So that's why we modernize our economy and also realize the industrialization. That's very important. So that's a reference for our African friends. So just my opinion, just a reference for you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My late mom would probably say your English is better than mine. Sabine, we were chatting a bit about, in preparation for this, about some of your experiences from the perspective of an OEM. And an OEM that sells and has sold and services and wants to service complex machinery, for example, that underpins our national electricity generation infrastructure. And it was a fascinating set of things that we spoke about. I'd much rather have you talk about them than me. Do you want to chat about some of the things you see that are easy wins for getting us ahead of the curve?
Sure. Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, first of all, maybe the road plan of ESCOM to get it ahead, I think, is a very well-drafted document. And working with ESCOM, it outlines exactly of where the challenges are, and we appreciate that because I think it was never that clear before. So thanks a lot, first of all. But there are certain areas. I mean, when companies work with us, and what we see is particular around the elephant in the room, the compliance, Zondo Commission or various other commissions which are ongoing, they do have an impact on the ability of the state-owned entities, right? Because, I mean, the people which are currently making decisions, they are, a bit fearful because they have reported to management, which maybe is today, not as on vogue anymore. They might have seen certain transaction going past, but, as an employee, you can choose when you get fired, being complicit or later on, yeah? I mean, it is a bit an issue where we as a company also feel for the employees of ESCOM, because you cannot just throw everything overboard and say, well, today we start on a clean sheet. But there are certain areas where private interest and public procurement act and the way on how we govern state-owned entities sometimes hinders development. Yeah? And I give you one example, for instance, with ESCOM, as you know, the minister has highlighted that in the transition paper, that the duration of the outages is a problem, right? So you plan a year ahead when certain power station and units come off, and then unforeseen other defaults happen, then the one more reliable can't go off. But we would have planned now with our resources, which we need to bring in, the timeline when they will fly in, when they have a visa. So now the 3 months visa expires, the outage I maybe get only in a year. So then I have the Department of Home Affairs, which I need to convince that I have the same guy applying in 6 months for the same visa again. Why does he come back? And I think these are things where, in collaboration, we would be able to sort that, maybe have a 1 or 2 years visa to give ESCOM the space to really have the flexibility in the outage, but also give us the space as a OEM, and I'm not talking about Siemens, the other ones are equally affected.
Sorry, Sabine. Sorry, you could contemplate a list of critical skills employees at the senior technical ranks in Siemens, as you could for other OEMs, right? And just sign off on that, or for high skills visas, right? For
Correct.
example.
Correct.
So these timing issues don't emerge.
Correct, exactly. So then have you, for these skills, which we can identify who the individuals are, you just put it once into the system, and it just gives for everybody a bit a breathing space, because you don't make every department a bottleneck, and people have to touch it more often than once, because, I mean, efficiency, and that was clearly mentioned just now, is one of the most important part in order to get economic stimulus going. But on the other hand, there are also areas particular to partner with ESCOM, because the majority of the fleet, of the generating capacity, belongs to the state via ESCOM right now. So for us as a private party to participate maybe in a conversion of a diesel-fired power station into gas, which would reduce the cost, and let us maybe come in with capital, because capital is currently a bit stressed, right? So we would be able to manage it, because the project size is overviewable, and that is easily fundable by our organization. So these kind of things on how, public procurement act by doing the right thing and also ensuring compliance, because that's the reason to why we have it in the first place. But that it doesn't hinder, tapping into certain areas. And I do believe, I mean, my wish would be that around these kind of arrangements, which are possible, we have a very open dialogue, that we don't have, a dialogue where we had deals in the past where nobody knows and then money flows into funny areas, but rather make it transparent to everybody, that everybody knows what is ESCOM committing to, with whom they are committing to, and if it's, a fair price. I mean, at the end of the day, for us as an OEM, we have a strong interest that companies like ESCOM and Transnet really become back to their old glory, because they are essential to bring this country forward. And their reliability of supply of services is essential for South Africa. The transport maybe even more than the energy sector, and the minister alluded to Transnet, because to having that functional and having companies like here, Volkswagen, BMW, all the automobile industries which rely on the shipment and the services of Transnet, having them the benefit at a competitive price.
So you could quite easily conceive of a table, perhaps at the Ministry of Public Enterprises, with senior departmental officials sitting on one side and senior officials from the OEM sitting on another, and saying these are common issues and we can resolve them.
Sure,
okay.
Exactly.
Thank you. Leslie, I've known you for many years. You saved me from a homeless night in London 25 years ago, and I want to thank you for that publicly. But he's a generous man. But you also occupy, at least in my imagination, quite an interesting position, in the sense that you've straddled the private sector, various government departments and ministries, all in a senior capacity. You've been deployed by the nation to the New Development Bank, colloquially the BRICS Bank, right? So you have, and you're one of our technocratic elite on that side of the world, charged with investing in the BRICS economies, but also in your homeland. What are you seeing? How can we unlock doors? What do you need from us as a country to make your work easier so that there's a flow of funds?
much, Derek, for a kind introduction. A couple of things. I've had the pleasure of living in Shanghai now for 4.5 years. And one of the most fascinating aspects about Chinese society, in my view, is the ability to do long-term strategic planning, right? We do have a long-term plan in South Africa, the National Development Plan. It only stretches to 2030. But in China, Beijing, for example, one of the largest cities, the capital city, has got a 2067 plan. In other words, government policymakers have a vision of what the city should look like, what kind of green space should they have when they build a new airport, seeing it as an aerotropolis, as a new hub for innovation and within that city. So the first aspect that I think we need to sort of sharpen and deepen is our ability to do long-term strategic planning. And by that, I don't mean sort of, 10-year sort of plans. I'm talking here about looking at technology, looking at what are the breakthroughs, and painting and imagining what a future ESCOM could look like. Not just generation, transmission, distribution, but what are the technological breakthroughs, for example, in generation? What will battery storage mean for the way energy will be produced in South Africa? So that's one of the missing elements that I find in South Africa, to be blunt, Derek. We have when we have transitions in leadership, we tend to go back to the planning horizon. Minister Mboweni and Gordhan, I see you looking at me very sternly there. What I'm suggesting is that we have longer-term visions, and the political leadership, whether it's the mayors, whether it's MECs, whether it's ministers, they simply implement that long-term strategic vision of the nation. So that's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is that we have to unlock. There clearly are a few challenges that South Africa face right now. One was spoken about this morning in the regulatory space. If you just look at telecoms and you look at spectrum as a key lever of change. So those are some of the easy wins. I think we need to identify what are those easy wins which can enable greater investment in infrastructure from the private sector. And that's the second point. The third point that I would like to come to is sort of innovation in finance. South Africa, as you know, has got one of the most developed financial and banking systems in the world. We probably rank in the top 10 at least. I've lived in China now for a good number of years, and you have the largest banks in China, you have some of the largest asset managers, some of the biggest hedge funds, some of the biggest firms in finance. But there's a lot more that South Africa can do to position ourselves as a hub of global finance. I'll give you one concrete example. Next to Shanghai is a little city called Hangzhou, which is where Alibaba is headquartered. Alibaba Ant Financial Services, for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a $150 billion company that has basically become the leaders in mobile payments and e-commerce. There's a lot we can learn from China, but there's also a lot that South Africa can offer. We have a financial services infrastructure here, and with imaginative partnerships, there's a lot more that we can do with our BRICS countries. So I would like to see much more deeper and meaningful economic trade and investment relationships being forged with our BRICS partners. So Africa is the smallest economy in the 5 BRICS countries, but there's so much that we can offer if we use our strengths imaginatively. And then finally, we have now reached, as I mentioned this morning, $2 billion, which represents about 17% of the BRICS portfolio. So South Africa is moving up to what I would consider to be an equitable share because we own 20% of the bank. But I think we have to look beyond just the capital allocation. There is a lot more that we can bring to the BRICS partnership.
Thanks, Leslie. So we've essentially run out of time, but with the remaining time, and not out of deference, but I'd like to return to our 2 ministers. More out of an intellectual curiosity about a particular topic, and either or both is the invitation is extended, and it goes something like this. So this infrastructure carries with it the promise of unlocking economic growth. Heightened investment or accelerated investment and sustainable investment in infrastructure, and we're coming off a decade of, as some of our panelists have alluded to, some decisions that perhaps wouldn't stand the rigor of light today. Similarly, our fiscal position is compromised. We've got to repair, and then we've got to grow. I guess the question I have is, as we chart this new path. And as we start describing to investors, both foreign and domestic, that this is the new way, credibility becomes an important dimension in the conversation. And I have two, I guess, allied questions there. One is, are South Africans going to have to make sacrifices as part of, ordinary South Africans, as part of defining that credibility? Because credibility ultimately is also about signaling to the investor class. And if that's the case, my second question is, how are we doing on signaling that narrative? So that we don't stay in the realm of the elite and in the realm of technocratic arguments or technical arguments, but that we take the narrative of what we're all going to have to do to the street. Your thoughts?
Well, the key issue is not to talk about the same thing over and over again, but to do something about what you have agreed you're going to do. And that's how you get progress. And so, as I say, we're setting up this blended infrastructure fund, which will be in the business of doing things. In the process of doing things, we also must be humble enough to understand that there are certain things we don't have the know-how about, and therefore go to the world and seek the know-how to work with us, unashamedly. And it's in that way, I think, that what you say, the promise and possibilities become realized. Now, we have identified already a number of projects. Some are at an advanced stage. And what Mr. Baloyi and his team, maybe working with the National Treasury, need to do is to implement those projects. Oh, Tlamini, sorry. Well, he looks like Mr. Baloyi. So, yeah. I was for many years mistaken for Peter Mkaba. So, now the projects have been identified. Some are at an advanced stage. And by the time we meet again next year, we shouldn't be talking about projects which have been identified last year, which have not been implemented. So there has to be movement forward. I think that's what we need to do. This being an investment conference, it therefore means that our investment partners must walk with us in this journey of implementation, including the new development bank. Thank you very much.
Minister Gordhan?
If you asked our rugby team, as they reminded us yesterday, 18 months ago, will you win the World Cup in Japan, they would have said no. So let's just remember, with a spirit of hope and optimism, that around 2010, we were spending R1 trillion every 3 years in fixed investment in this economy for about 6 years in a row, right? So that's about 350 billion rands per year during that period. So we do have a very positive legacy behind us, so we should be proud of that. We've lost that momentum, and as my colleague says, we need to pick that momentum up again. The second thing is start getting our institutions, our planning and execution capability, and above all, our bureaucracy shaped in the right kind of way. A way which says there must be a new sense of urgency. So we don't have to go through 50 signatures to get something approved that takes 9 months. It can be done in 9 weeks or 9 days in certain cases without compromising regulatory requirements or other requirements as well. So you need a reorientation of the mind where urgency becomes a factor, where the business sector and other investors get a signal that South Africa is indeed serious. And I suppose the visas one day will prove to us that we're moving in the right kind of direction. And the last is, as my colleague said, is to build up that capability again and the pipeline of skills. Having one generation that has the skills is one thing. Having several generations that are in the pipeline that are ready to take over year after year, because as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, some of these are long-term projects. They take 10 years in some cases, and they need to be maintained over 30 or 40 years as well. So building up that pipeline of skills, the culture and a discipline which says we need to look after the assets that we already have in the ground and look for new opportunities at the same time through the infrastructure fund and other funds is, I think, a key responsibility we have. But there was an important point made by one of our colleagues in the panel, and that is we're going through a period where it's not just ordinary people and the government and so on that needs to make sacrifices. Everybody needs to come to the party, whether it's the unions, whether it's the business sector, which says, I'm not going to make multiples of returns. Right now, I'm going to make a modest return. I'll establish my reputation here. There'll be better opportunities as we go forward. So now is the time to sacrifice a little bit in the short term so that we can get benefits in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. So speaking as a South African, not a moderator, I'm starting to feel the anger moving to optimism and a gees for the future. Thank you to the panel, and thank you for everyone who listened to us. A round of applause for our panel, please.